things around, and certainly they made their share of mistakes over the years. But this was not a franchise that was used to any measure of sustained success. So they had to basically rebuild the culture while also keeping that passionate fan base that had stayed with the team all of those years.
That's an interesting point, because I wondered how much pushback they got, not only from players, but people in their organization, maybe even with the NBA itself, because this was a whole new dynamic.
Yeah, I think you saw that early on. Obviously, there was this, sort of initial honeymoon period, and I think they were more happy that Chris Bohan was not the owner than they were happy that Joe Lacob and Peter Guber had bought the team from him. I think that honeymoon period lasted perhaps about a year, and then the fans started remembering just how truly awful this team could be. I think they knew that they had a talented guy like Steph Curry, but this was a guy who couldn't stay healthy. He had acute ankle injuries where it looked like they were going to derail his entire career. And then they go and decide to trade a guy like Monte Ellis in March of 2012. And in the book, you read it, this is really the low point. This is the nadir of all of this. They trade Ellis and for a guy in Andrew Bogut who wasn't going to play basketball for at least 8 or 9 months. He was injured. And so the fans, they basically revolted. They booed Joe Lacob at center court on the night that they were retiring Chris Mullin's jersey. And it was just, if we ever can feel any empathy for a professional sports owner billionaire, that really was kind of that moment, because he really was just sort of dressed down, and it was just really ugly to watch, but not undeserved. And I think that Joe Lacob would tell you that these days. They had to make a lot of mistakes, but at the same time, they had to learn from them as they went along.
One thing I'll point out to people, because I know Joe Lacob fairly well, I was doing an early version of the Women's Basketball League, and he was one of the major financial backers for that league. So I got to know him as I was doing the play-by-play on their national television package. And yet one of his partners is Peter Guber. Now, these two men kind of come from different directions. Peter Guber is more of an entertainment-oriented guy, and Joe Lacob came from, I guess, the investment world as well. Give people more background on these two and how that marriage has worked and affected this franchise.
They're friends going back quite a few years. They actually both have Boston roots. Peter Guber still has an extremely thick Boston accent, which is really, he's a very excitable fella. So, it often comes out when he's talking to crowds and talking to fans. But, Joe, came from a small industrial town on the South Shore of Massachusetts. And he grew up worshiping the Celtics. He'll say that, when a lot of kids grow up wanting to play basketball, he grew up wanting to own a basketball team. This is something he's thought about for a long time. And when his family moved out to Southern California when he was a teenager, he would sell peanuts at Angel Stadium, and he would stack them 4 high because he could make a greater commission that way. I mean, he was thinking about efficiency levels when he's selling peanuts at a baseball game. And then he worked his way up. He went to UCLA, he went to UC Irvine, he got an MBA from Stanford, and then that was when he came to the Bay Area, really solidified himself as a venture capitalist. But at the time he bought the Warriors, he had been a season ticket holder for 10 years. So, this was not some Johnny-come-lately. This was not some, deep-pocketed savior. This was a guy that really understood the Warriors culture. And when he bought the team, I think he, more than anybody else, really knew what was at stake.
Yeah, I might point out he paid a record price of better than $400 million. But I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, Erik, I think the fact that prior to buying the Warriors, he was a minority owner of the Boston Celtics, and to me, that gave him insights where he could look and see how things actually operated, and then maybe, think about, well, if I had a team, I could do this. Am I correct in that observation?
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, think about, a guy who, he was still a season ticket holder, but I think, he's down in L.A. at Staples Center, wearing Celtics gear, as the Celtics are playing the Lakers in the finals. This is a guy, in a sense, he's being pulled in all of these sort of different emotional directions. But you're absolutely right. Spending a few years as a minority owner with the Celtics, and winning a championship, we should say. This was a guy that he got to see how that intimate side of the decision-making process. Although he, I think he might have felt some personal frustrations because he wasn't really an integral part of that decision-making process. And I feel like, when he saw that the Warriors were available, he thought, this is my moment. These moments really only come around once in a lifetime. And I think that he was perfectly positioned to be the guy who could step in, lead the ownership group, and to apply the lessons that he had learned from 25 years in Silicon Valley.
We've got about 2 minutes left. Peter Guber is a very interesting person. He has a interest in ownership of a minority baseball team in the Midwest. Yeah. And tell me a little bit about his entertainment background and how that fit into this package.
Yeah, he's a